Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan. Welcome to the latest episode of our sports show. As you know, we've been previewing live on air for the last upcoming month or so about our new rugby documentary called My Life in Rugby, Global Rugby Legends, where we're speaking to renowned players from the Northern Hemisphere countries, France, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland and Italy, and the Southern Hemisphere countries, Australia, Argentina, New Zealand and South Africa. In terms of this documentary, we're taking these sort of rugby renowned legends on a sort of journey down through the past in terms of their childhood, growing up, sort of memories, and how they aspire to play in the top of the game, whether it be winning 5 or 6 nations, appearing in Grand Slams, World Cup finals, appearing on Lions tours, and playing at the highest level of the games. And our guest this evening is what we call the most capped player for Wales, surpassing Neil Jenkins when he was the most capped person, appearing on 92 appearances, 92 caps for Wales, 24 points as well between 80 when he started in 1989 all the way up as far as 2004. His brother Glenn also played for Wales, and his current son now is Max is establishing himself as a real prominent rugby player at Cardiff as well. He's captained Wales on no less than 7 occasions. He's appeared in 3 Rugby World Cups, 1995, 99 and 2003, and in his time wearing the Welsh jersey, appearing as a lock for Wales, he played over 8 different head coaches, the one and only Gareth Llewelyn. And Gareth, one thing that struck me looking about your resume, and it's kind of, I've spoken to like 30, 32, 3 players as well. Most of them, in terms of international rugby, have played under maybe 1, 2 head coaches, maybe 3 at max.
Sure.
You've played under 8. How do you start to keep coming in after the 4th coach leaves and then the 5th one sort of comes in, and you're just, have I to sort of introduce myself all over again, or how does that start? Are you trying to think to yourself, how long is he going to last? So you're sort of taking bets on it or something. It's a weird phenomenon. In club rugby, you get it, but normally in international rugby, head coaches do 6-7 year terms, and in a player's career, he might only go through 3 head coaches at most, but 8 head coaches is something remarkable.
Yeah, well, I think it probably tells a tale about the turbulent history of Welsh rugby. Really, particularly in the 90s, we lost a generation of players to rugby league, and as a result of that, results were far from favourable. And as they say, the buck stops with the coach. And so the turnover of coaches was certainly far bigger than it should have been. But so I hung around a long time, and I saw 8 of them come and go, really.
Yeah, I suppose, Gareth, in terms of your family, in terms of growing up, I've spoken to the Quinnell family, and obviously Craig's brother, and then Craig's father, and then his uncle was the great Red Ian St. John, in terms of who played for Wales as well. In terms of your sort of family history, obviously yourself and your brother have played for Wales, and your son, but does it go back even further than that, Gareth, in terms of the Welsh sort of connection, in terms of rugby? Is there a history or pedigree in your family?
So only in that my dad actually was a military man, and when he served out in Hong Kong, he represented the colony against various New Zealand touring sides. So funny enough, something that has just been sort of driven by the Hong Kong Rugby Union, myself and my brother presented my dad with his Hong Kong rugby cap only a couple of years ago. My dad's 85 now. So so dad was a fairly decent player, but he spent his career in the army, and obviously played at that level. And I think did a little bit of rugby league. I think back in the day, if you were a serviceman, you could play rugby league as an amateur, and it wouldn't sort of broach your amateur status if you played rugby league. So I think he had a couple of games for Rochdale Hornets or something. But but beyond that, I mean, dad's the kind of only one in the family who's played rugby to any level, really, outside of myself and my brother.
Okay, and Gareth, you mentioned there about your father being based overseas, and obviously you mentioned there about being in Hong Kong. Did you spend many of your early years away from Wales in terms of growing up as a family? Were you sort of based in Hong Kong for a while? Did you move to several different places? Did you have to sort of relocate a few sorts of times before you made your way back to Wales?
I mean, I didn't go to Hong Kong. My brother was in Hong Kong with him. Then they came back, and we went over to Germany, and we moved around a little bit. But by the time I was about 7 years old, we kind of settled down in Cardiff, in and around Cardiff. So I kind of did most of my growing up in South Wales, if you like. And Dad was a rugby nut. He loved it. And back in the day, it was kind of what you did on weekends in the evenings, either on a spare bit of grass or out in the street. You just played rugby, touch rugby, and everyone kind of, that's what you did as a kid. There weren't many other options.
And I suppose, Gareth, you mentioned there about rugby and playing sort of touch rugby and all that. And obviously we know about Cardiff as well. It's a big soccer area, a big sort of football area as well. And you'd have maybe past greats in terms of like John Toshak and players like that who have played for Wales, and they would be role models for kids growing up in those sorts of days that they would have sort of looked up to. In terms of you, was it always rugby, or did you follow every sort of sport? Did you play a bit of soccer? Are you good at athletics, track and field, or was it predominantly rugby? You just found your niche in that, and that's all you did?
Well, I mean, in the early days, certainly it was rugby, and really that was what was driven in the schools. There wasn't much I think if you wanted to play football, you played that out of school. Funnily enough, I found motorbikes when I was kind of in my early teens, and did a bit of schoolboy motocross racing pretty badly, but it was good fun. Really enjoyed that side of it. So. And it's an interest that I've always maintained. But in terms of my activity in sport, it was for the most part rugby, yeah. But I wasn't a serious rugby player in my teens. Really, I was kind of almost a reluctant rugby player to a certain extent.
Okay, and I suppose, Gareth, you mentioned there about pursuing a career in rugby, and obviously there was no such thing back in the 80s and when you came out of pursuing a career in rugby, because rugby very much back in 1988, 1987, it was an amateur sport, and it was prolonged that it could have always been an amateur sport. There was no way of looking into a crystal ball, knowing it would go professional when it sort of did, maybe a decade, even so later. So what did Gareth Llewelyn and his family had in mind in sort of preparing himself for adulthood? Did you go to college? Did you pick up a trade? Were you a tradesman? What was the sort of idea in terms of that sort of, obviously rugby was the pastime, that was the hobby, but what was Gareth Llewelyn going to do to earn a living?
Oh, well, so I got an apprenticeship in Port Talbot Steelworks. So I went into engineering in Port Talbot Steelworks, and I did a 4-year apprenticeship there, and then got a job there as a fitter once I'd qualified, and I really enjoyed it, and that sort of finishing as an apprentice kind of coincided with moving into senior rugby as well. So I would kind of work in Port Talbot as my day job, go to the gym straight after work, and go to rugby training in Neath straight after that. So it was kind of quite long days actually, 8 in the morning until I'd probably get home 10 in the night on training nights.
Okay, and Gareth, lock was your position that you fixed upon in terms of your Wales international career, but I imagine growing up as a kid playing rugby, you probably touched on all different positions and in terms of before settling on lock. I imagine you were number 8, you were probably a flanker, you were probably in all different positions. But did you ever try your hand at the backs? Was it always just in the forwards, or could Gareth Llewelyn kick off both feet?
I think I could actually kick, and as a youth player, I used to take conversions for my youth team, and I think in my head I always thought I could probably play centre if I really wanted to, but realistically, the back 5 of the scrum, I had 1 cap on the blind side, but and I played a little bit of club rugby at number 8. But yeah, I mean, I was a back 5 of the scrum player really, as much as anyone in Wales grew up wanting to be Gareth Edwards or Phil Bennett. But I think there comes a point when you realise where your future lies.
And in terms of those attributes, in terms of a lock, what would you sort of focus on? And if you were giving pointers to youngsters, what pointers were given to you in terms of that sort of position growing up? That maybe one or two things that stuck with you that you sort of took with your career all the way up along in terms of that sort of position?
Well, I mean, back in those days, I mean, it was very much set piece based. The line out was key. So you spend a lot of time doing line outs and scrimmaging, and there wasn't an awful lot of tackling, if you like, or ball carrying as a front five forward. You were there to sort of hit rucks, win the ball for the backs. That's the sort of modern game that we see now. Really didn't come in until the early 90s, really, I think, when with the advent of World Cups and people like Australia realizing that they could be a world champion and taking the game seriously. So I mean, I used to work hard, don't get me wrong, but the game that I started playing was very different to the one that I finished playing. I think the game probably changed more in the 20 years that I played it than in any other time in its history, because it went from amateur to turning professional, and all the law changes and game changes and defensive coaches. So there was a huge amount of change in the game from when I started it. But ultimately, even now, second rows and props, you have to be able to do the basics of your job and set. If a team doesn't have a set piece, then they're going to struggle against anyone. So the basics are critical, and it's for a second row, it's your line out work, it's your scrummaging work, and then outside of that, your work rate, ball carrying, hitting rucks, and your defence.
Okay, and I suppose, Gareth, in terms of making your sort of breakthrough with Wales, you broke onto the scene in the 25th of October 1989. You sort of made your debut in terms of Wales, but you came on a scene there in the 90s where Scotland and England were the probably dominant forces. France came into the scene then, the great sort of French sort of team in the sort of mid-90s, the sort of such. But it was probably, in the Five Nations back then, it was probably a tough period for Ireland and Wales in particular as well. Scotland had that sort of Scott Hastings, Craig Chalmers, that sort of Gavin Hastings, those type of players back then. So they were able on occasions to sometimes mix it with England, who were very strong with the Underwoods and Lugers and Carlings, and then obviously France and the Philippe Salahs and sort of stuff like that. Yeah. Was that sort of a period where Wales rugby had to go through an awful lot of sort of constant rebuilds and sort of year after year trying to blood and reblood and try and find a settled team, as did Ireland to do? And most times, did you feel that yourselves, Ireland and Scotland, were battling out third place spot realistically at the start of the Six Nations, given the size and pool of players that England and France had at their disposal?
Yeah, well, I've always said, if you do to any successful Welsh side or any, Irish, English side for that matter, if you do to them what happened to that Welsh team in that era, with the amount of players we lost to rugby league, like, Jonathan Davis, Scott Gibbs, Alan Bateman, you can reel off a whole back line. We lost 4 scrum halves to rugby league. We lost our tight head prop in Di Young to rugby league. We lost, a whole back row to rugby league. And that would have been the cornerstone of the side of the early 90s, and we lost those guys. And so you're right, we were sort of always rebuilding as we lost players. England were particularly big and strong at that time, and France always are. So it was it was a difficult time, and I think as I said, the game had just started changing. We'd had the 87 World Cup. All of a sudden, come 91, Australia are taking things seriously. They've won that one. South Africa come into back into the international fold sometime in the early 90s, and all of a sudden you've got a global game that's changing massively, and Wales are hemorrhaging players to rugby league, quicker than any country.
And obviously your brother, Glenn, played for Wales as well, and in terms of that sort of family sort of connection, we had it with the Underwoods in terms of Rory and sort of Tony playing for England as well, and obviously Craig and Scott did it for Wales as well. But was it almost felt like that when your brother was out in the field that you almost felt that you wanted that win even more in terms of that sort of family sort of connection? That was those sort of losses even harder when your brother was there suffering defeat beside you?
I mean, I never sort of reflected on it in a kind of defeat kind of way. It was, my brother was older than me, but he'd gone to university in London, so I was around the scene a lot more than he was. I was capped before Glyn was. And ultimately, we only played twice together for Wales. We had a great club partnership, and through various injuries and whatnot, we only ever ended up playing twice together for Wales. But, that was more of a kind of really big, proud family day for us. I mean, it was amazing that we were able to do that together. It wasn't kind of, I don't look back on it and reflect of how we dealt with the loss together. It was, having the opportunity to play together.
Yeah. And I suppose, Gareth, in your time, through the 90s, you would have come up against Ireland, and you would have come up against maybe in the lineouts, you would have come up against the likes of Paddy Johns, Mick Galway, and Anthony Foley. Lord versus Anthony's no longer with us in terms of that. And what were your sort of memories of competing around line of time with Paddy Johns and Mick Galway and Anthony Foley, and Foley's influence then on the back of the lineout as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think actually my first game against Ireland would have been over in Lansdowne Road, and I think Donald Lenihan was still playing actually at the time. So that game I jumped at the front of the line out against Donald, and he was a British Lion at the time, and I was still a young man really, and Donald was a kind of old, experienced, international forward, and so that was a fairly big and intimidating occasion. And then I went back to my more preferred position in the middle of the line out, and Ireland have had some great line out jumpers over the years. Paddy Johns was particularly difficult. Neil Francis, you've had many good ones through the ages really, and the Irish pack were always a handful to play against.
Yeah, and I suppose, Gareth, in terms of those times as well, as a pack, you're always led by your sort of scrum half and your fly half partnership. I spoke to Rob there only last night, and I suppose he wasn't too, let's say, overindulging about himself and Neil in terms of their contribution. But as a pack, they were so pivotal to you. When Wales were going well, Jenkins and Howley, it was the Batman and sort of Robin contingent. They really got your pack going.
Look, they kept us going forward. Rob was a phenomenal athlete, and he was a proper greyhound. And I think one of the best scrum halves that we've produced. And if you give him quick ball on the front foot, he was dangerous for sure. Neil, I mean, he was known for his kicking game, but he could play a bit. He had fantastic distribution as well, did Neil. And so the key for us as a pack was just to try and provide them with some good ball to keep the team going forward. And anything was possible, particularly when Rob was on the pitch. He was that good a player.
And Gareth, what was that first World Cup experience like in 1995? Obviously, breaking on the scene in 1989 in terms of that, and obviously experiencing that World Cup in 1995 when it came about. What were your sort of memories on that? Was it a joyful sort of occasion? And did you sort of go in with sort of hopes rather than expectations?
Well, we did the typical Welsh thing in sacking our coach just before we went to the World Cup. So we went out there with a new coach in Alec Evans, who'd come over to coach Cardiff, and done quite a successful job there. But after winning the Five Nations in '94, we then had a disappointing '95, got rid of our coaches, and took a brand new coaching team out to the World Cup. And I think everyone went there with expectation. No one really knew what to expect. We were based up in Bloemfontein, which was a little bit sort of off the beaten track, if you like. And we had Japan, New Zealand, and Ireland in our group, and it was a group we thought we could qualify out of, and probably I think everyone thought the key match was going to be against Ireland. That would be the match that, you know, I think everyone thought New Zealand would win the group. And Japan were not the team then that they are now, so that was hopefully a given for everyone. And then it was obviously the playoff between us and Ireland to go through as the other team out of the pool. And unfortunately, Ireland sort of prevailed on the day, and you know we really didn't perform. But as an experience, it was fantastic, you know, to have to be in a place like South Africa, which is a fantastic country to go to anyway. So a wonderful place to visit, and to be involved in a World Cup over there. It was an amazing experience.
And I suppose, Gareth, in terms of rugby and a rugby sort of career as such, for a Northern Hemisphere rugby player, obviously play for your country, to be good, be involved with a good team in terms of maybe you're involved with the English Premier team, maybe you're involved with your own sort of club team, to be prominent in the European Cup, the Heineken Cup as well. But the most pivotal thing that many players was to be a British and Irish Lion, and you came so close on occasion to sort of achieve that. How close really were you? Because people say that it was really a toss of a coin whether you were going to be a Lion or not.
Yeah, well, I think I was on standby 3 times. I think the first time was when they went to New Zealand. Wade Dooley's father died. So he came home, and Martin Johnson was called up. And Martin at the time, I think it had 1 cap, so he was fairly new to the game. In 94, whatever, the next trip when they went to South Africa, was it 96, when Doddy Weir got kicked in the knee and had to come home. Someone else went out then, I can't even remember who it was, and so there were 3 tours with 3 second-or injuries, for which I was on standby each time. And I think, you know, sometimes a lot of it is driven by who the coaches are at the time. You know, I think certainly in the early days there was a lot of English and Scottish influence on the coaching staff. So yeah, it's one of them. Look, you know, I mean, I was probably disappointed at the time. I don't really reflect on it now at all. It's, you know, I'm quite happy with what I got out of the game, and but you know, I can remember being out in Zimbabwe actually when Bob Norster, our team manager, said to me, "Get your bags packed." He said, "It looks like you're going to New Zealand." So I guess, you know, I was pretty close, and I was in the discussion, but never actually got the call up in the end.
And I suppose, Gareth, there's another sort of generation now. Your own son Max is playing for Cardiff and going well. Is Max a sort of a different sort of player compared to yourself and your brother? Is he a different type of sort of generation? Is it hard to compare fathers to sons and players a decade ago, because rugby has probably evolved and changed now in the professional game? Is it hard comparisons to try and compare him to someone else in the family?
Well, I mean, it's particularly hard with Max because he's a centre, so we're completely different positions, you know, which, you know, I think actually is a good thing. You know, people don't draw comparisons so much, and you know, he's a far better athlete than I ever was. You know, he's not quite as tall. He's maybe an inch shorter than me, but a far better athlete. So you know, he's making his own way in the game, and I'm glad in a way that he's not a second row, because people won't then draw you know, natural comparisons.
I suppose, Gareth, one thing about you and your career, and you can probably look back, and I know some players have been in World Cup finals, some players have won 5 Nations or sort of Grand Slams, and you had a dubious honour, as you mentioned, of winning, being part of Wales team that won the 5 Nations. But some players endure sort of crippling injuries, and the careers can get cut short. Even like Craig Kinnell was telling me about his injury, and it was never really the same again. But the longevity of your career, 89 to 04, 3 decades, 3 World Cups, that sort of longevity to play at that spell, in terms of, I know you might have had 1 or 2 knocks away, but no real serious something that you could have. That must be sort of grateful as well, because it seems, looking at you, it hasn't left its toll on your body either.
Look, you know, well, after that World Cup in my last cap in 2004, then I played for another 4 years. So I played till I was 39 at professional level in the English Premiership, and And I'm incredibly grateful for it. And, you know, I stayed away from serious knee injuries and big shoulder dislocations. So I had a couple of shoulder ops and I had an operation on my pelvis, but and I always kept myself, you know, I do think I always kept myself in really good condition. I trained really hard. I worked hard in pre-season. I always felt like I looked after my body in that respect, or gave myself the best chance to play. So I'm incredibly grateful for the amount of time I was able to play the game, and what I got out of it. You know, we went through difficult times, certainly with the Welsh team in the 90s, but you know, I'm still grateful that I was a part of that, and you know, met some incredible people on the way. I've played in some amazing countries, and you know, just to be part of the Six Nations and go to places like Lansdowne Road, Murrayfield, the Parc des Princes as it was when I started. It's been, you know, the most fun, if you like, if that's the best way to describe it, or the most rewarding experience, you know, 20-year experience of playing, you know, first of all, top class and then professional rugby.
And finally, to meet you, Gareth Llewelyn, if you to look into the mirror now and you saw a 28, 29-year-old Gareth Llewelyn standing, competing for lineouts, going up, as you said, against the likes of Neil Francis or so, what sort of attributes did he bring to the Welsh jersey every time he put on the jersey? What could his teammates sort of rely on in terms of what he brought to the table? What was his sort of strengths or his sort of enthusiasm that he brought?
You know, I think it was work rate and hard work. You know, I mean, it was set piece basics, so providing ball, line out, and scrum, and you know, supporting my props, and just work rate around the field. You know, getting around, making tackles, getting over the ball at ruck time, and just a real workhorse. You know, someone who brought that work ethic to just do his best for the team.
Okay. On that note, Gareth Llewelyn, thanks for joining us today to share your memories of your time playing with Wales throughout over 3 decades. 92 caps is a lot. 24 points in the Wales jersey, appeared from 89 to 04, made in total broke Neil Jenkins' record of 92 caps, and appeared in 3 World Cups, 1995, 1999 and 03, and captain Wales on no less than 7 occasions. Gareth Llewelyn, this is your life in rugby, and thanks for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.